Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. And of course, to the Graduate Center that is organizing this panel. And especially to our two presenters today. So I am really glad to moderate this panel. Well, I think that for everybody is clear that in recent years, the racial inequality in Cuba has become a real issue. And there is a lot of so this has prompted a lot of a variety of research. But today we are really, sorry, at least I am really excited because this is a very important research that will be presented today. Is really, so the data that we will be able to receive today is a result of I think it's 2 years groundbreaking survey. It was made in Cuba and not only focused in Havana, which is really, I think, one of the most important features of this research project. It was done throughout the island and taking into account different sectors. Well, this is, well, as I have said, this is the 2-year-long research project that has been founded by the German Research Council. We have here, of course, Professor Bert Hoffmann, which is a senior researcher at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies and head of this GIGA Berlin office. And he's also a professor of political science at the Freie Universität Berlin. His latest publications include immigrant policies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and bureaucratic socialism in reform mode, the changing politics of Cuba's post-Fidel era. And of course, there is Professor Katrin Hansen that most of us, we know her from, she has been working about Cuba since a long time ago, and she's associate professor of anthropology at Baruch College and senior research fellow at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. She has spent the past 20 years conducting research on issues of race, inequality, migration, transnational ties, and youth in Cuba and its diaspora. And her latest publications include Race and Inequality in the New Cuba, Reasons, Dynamics, and Manifestations, and then also Race and Rising Inequality in Cuba. So please join me to welcome our two presenters. And,
Thank you, Odette. Is this on? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to first begin by thanking the Bildner Institute and the Graduate Center for inviting us, in particular Mauricio Font for having us here today to share our data, and also Odette Casamayor. Thank you so much for coming. We are here to finally share our findings with you on, as Odette just mentioned, a 2-year-long German Research Council-funded project looking at the growing racial inequalities in Cuba. Now, I'm sure most of you know that social inequalities in general, but racial inequalities in particular, have increased immensely in the past few years. I've been working on issues of race and racism in Cuba for a while now, but this latest increase has been even just visually quite stark. And so Bert and I started talking about how we could go about researching this in a more empirical manner. We're lucky enough to get the German Research Council the council to fund us to do this. So what we try to basically understand is why these racial inequalities, the reasons why they've been growing, and the dynamics behind this growth. And particularly, we have been interested in the role of remittances, or rather, I should say, migration, remittances, citizenship, and also the recent economic reforms undertaken by Raúl Castro. So we started our field work Thank you. We started our fieldwork about a year and a half ago, of which I spent about 8 months in Cuba directing and conducting the actual fieldwork. And with the support of 4 Cuban research assistants, we were able to administer 1,050 surveys or questionnaires and also 200 interviews all over the island. And I think this is what makes our survey quite unique. It's not Havana-based, it's actually a nationwide survey, i.e. in all provinces. The survey and the interviews included detailed questions on issues ranging from migration, family, remittances, labor, income, savings, the private sector, citizenship, mobility, and race and ethnicity, among other things. I'm a social anthropologist, Bert is a political scientist, and so methodologically and theoretically, we complement each other quite well. Now, the research is now completed, and we are currently analyzing the data and writing it up. And today, we are here to share some of our findings with you. In my presentation, or my part of the presentation, I will mainly focus on the role of remittances, or the relationship between racial inequality and remittances, and Bert will mainly talk about the issue of citizenship. Before I begin, though, I would like to mention that although we are well aware of the diversity and complexity of racial identities in Cuba, in our study, we solely differentiated between 2 racial identities, namely so-called blancos, or white Cubans, and so-called Afro-Cubanos, or Afro-Cubans. Our definition of Afro-Cubanos in our survey is very inclusive and includes all Cubans who are phenotypically of African descent, while the category blancos, or whites, included all Cubans who are phenotypically white, i.e. who look white. Now, belonging to one or the other racial identity was determined by self-identification by the interviewee as well as the interviewer. There was no discrepancy between the 2 answers in any of the 1,050 questionnaires administered. Next slide. Now, to put all of this, our study, into some context, I'm sure most of you know that racial inequality in Cuba is not a new issue, but has a very long and complex history, the roots of which can not only be found in Spanish colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and the institution of slavery in Cuba, but also in the island's Republican period. In other words, before 1959, Cuba's socioeconomic stratification was closely connected with race. Now, the Cuban Revolution aimed to change this reality, amongst other things, and indeed, through the implementation of a series of radical social and economic policies, Fidel Castro's socialist government, I should say, was able to create a relatively egalitarian society within the first 3 decades of the revolution. However, since the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, when Cuba fell into a deep economic crisis, the so-called periodo especial, poverty, social inequalities, and again, especially racial inequalities, have once again resurfaced. Now, since this time, 2 currencies legally circulate in Cuba: the Cuban convertible peso, or CUC, which is pegged to the US dollar, and the original peso cubano, which has become virtually worthless. And the problem, as many of you know, is that state workers, who still make up the majority of the workforce, are paid their salaries in pesos cubanos. However, since the early 1990s, Cuban reality is such that everyone needs hard currency, or CUC, to survive. Stores and state-run businesses have become almost exclusively CUC-based, as has the booming black market and all tourist-related services and venues. Moreover, prices are extremely high, given that most consumer goods, including the majority of Cuba's food supply, are imported. In this context, the average monthly state worker salary of roughly 680 or 90 pesos cubanos, roughly $25 US, is not enough to feed a family. And as a result, most Cubans are looking for CUC or hard currency to supplement their state incomes. However, given that legal access to hard currency or cook is mostly limited to Cuba's tourist industry, joint ventures, the still small but growing private sector and or family remittances from abroad, many Cubans are involved in some form of illegal or informal activity to make ends meet. Moreover, apart from this the divisive nature of the double economy, all of the just mentioned legal avenues of gaining access to hard currency or cook are connected with race. For example, as our colleague Alejandro de la Fuente's research has shown, as job competition in the lucrative sectors of the economy, especially tourism, intensified in the late 1990s, racist arguments were deployed to minimize the access of Black Cubans to them. Racist ideas and concepts such as buena presencia have worked especially against Afro-Cubans in the tourist industry. And although this practice has been criticized and begun to change over the past years, there are still many more white Cubans employed in key positions in both tourism and joint venture companies. Also, due to the Afro-Cubans' relative concentration in areas with rundown and overcrowded housing, the opening of private businesses such as family-operated restaurants, so-called paladares, and bed and breakfasts, which are two of the most lucrative ways of earning hard currency legally, is not a viable option for most Black families. And now to the topic of remittances, the so-called remesas. Now, since the 1990s, when it became legal to send remittances to Cuba, a lot of money has been sent to the island from the diaspora. Currently, an estimated annual amount of $3 billion in remittances is sent to Cuba every year. However, because many Cubans in the diaspora prefer to use informal mechanisms, the so-called mulas, as these are much less expensive than companies such as Western Union, we don't really know how much money is sent to the island every year, only that it is much, much more than $3 billion. The majority of these remittances come from the Cuban exile or emigre community in South Florida, and because this community is overwhelmingly white, in fact, according to the U.S. Immigration Bureau and Census, 90% of Cubans in the U.S. are phenotypically white. Researchers have long assumed that the majority of these remittances also mainly benefit white households on the island. Now, the few previous studies on this topic, in fact, there's only one by Sarah Blue and several survey-based studies by Manuel Orozco and myself, confirm this hypothesis. However, these studies were not only done 10 to 15 years ago, but also solely focused on Havana. Moreover, they were undertaken during a time when Cuban Americans could legally only send $300 a quarter or $1,200 a year. Do you remember those years? Under George W. Bush, to nuclear family members on the island. In other words, until now, we haven't had any data looking at the relationship between remittances and race on a national level in Cuba. By the way, this is also true for the large amount of material remittances in the form of food, clothing, toiletries, home appliances, toys, etc., that are sent to families in Cuba. Now, with the latest economic reforms undertaken by Raúl Castro, the so-called lineamientos, much has changed and has arguably become even more complicated. On the one hand, the private sector has been expanded and liberalized. There's now a new tax code, an agricultural reform, the private real estate and automobile markets have been legalized, and the much criticized Cuban exit visa was eliminated, allowing for greater international travel. But on the other hand, unemployment, further outward migration, and the already existing poverty and social inequalities are growing. And these negative trends are in part due to international factors such as the continued US embargo, the lack of FDI, etc., but also due to a range of domestic macroeconomic factors such as the lack of production on the island, the low state wages, state employee layoffs, which have been quite numerous in the past few years, cuts in social spending, as well as increasing food and gas prices. However, it also has something to do with Cuba's insufficient credit system, which does not make it possible for most Cubans to get a loan or mortgage in order to, for instance, take part in the small business sector. The same can be said about the lack of wholesale markets and business training programs. This is particularly surprising given that the government's own reform logic expected a large number of the now unemployed to join the private sector. Under these circumstances, it is thus now mainly Cubans with access to private capital who can start their own business. Private capital here being savings and/or remittances in the form of startup capital from the diaspora. And so it is important here to remember that under Obama, most prior restrictions on how much money could be sent to whom on the island were eliminated, and that until now, this still stands under the Trump administration. So de facto, unlimited amounts of remittances can be sent to the island. Now, given this context and situation and the strong historical ties between migration, remittances, and race, the question is, what role do these factors play in the new Cuban economy and in the re-stratification of Cuban society? And without further ado, I will now present you our findings. Okay, so here you can see our survey. We had 1,050 participants, of which 56% receive remittances and 44% do not receive remittances. Of those, 57% are white or were white, and 43% Afro-Cuban of the entire number of people we interviewed. Now, the next is very, we get right into the heart of the matter. Here you can see of those people who receive remittances, 78% are white, and only 22% are Afro-Cuban. We were even surprised at this. We knew it was bad, but we didn't imagine it to be quite this stark. Now, we asked folks why, of people who don't receive remittances, we asked them, why don't you receive remittances? And this is very, very interesting what people answered. So most Afro-Cubans, 85% said because they don't have family outside of Cuba, which is, very, very logical and what we assumed. But most whites, white Cubans who don't receive remittances answered que no le hace falta. They don't need remittances. They are economically well off enough to not need to have remittances sent to them anymore. If we would have done this survey maybe 10 to 15 years ago, we probably would have had a very different set of answers. We also asked folks what their average yearly income is, and this is also very interesting. Now, most, as I mentioned before, state workers only earn, around $25, the equivalent of $25 US a month, so only make about $300 US a year. So most Cubans still fall under this $3,000 mark, which we set up, even white Cubans. But as you can see, most Afro-Cubans, in fact, almost 96%, make, way less than $3,000 a year. And you can see that there are many more white Cubans who are starting to make a lot more money. So there is a growing class of mainly white Cubans who are living more stable, economically speaking, lives, and even some who we could call, who are now part of this nouveau riche Cuban class. There are very few Afro-Cubans who are part of that. We asked people also who are part of the private sector what they do for a living. We were interested in how that might differ along racial lines. And we found out, it does. So among Afro-Cubans, the most popular sector is the small retail sector, which includes everything from people who have a little kiosk and might sell coffee or croquetas or whatever, to people who sell secondhand clothing or anything. And this is the most popular sector among Afro-Cubans. The other one is people who are craftsmen, i.e. plumbers, carpenters, construction workers, painters, etc. And thirdly, the small restaurant. This is not paladares. These are small little restaurants, cafeterias, kiosks, often in pesos cubanos, that they own and work in. On the other hand, white Cubans, the largest group, you can see 30% have casa particulares, i.e. bed and breakfasts. They earn hard currency or CUC. And as you can see, no Afro-Cuban we ask, or only a small percentage are in that group. The other sector, very interesting, is the beauty industry, which is booming. So under the beauty business sector, where whites are now very, very involved, falls everything from hair salons to nail studios, but also spas, yoga studios, Pilates studios, and this is a booming industry in Cuba, many of which are also cook-based. And thirdly, also the small restaurant business. You will probably have noticed that only 6% of white Cubans in our survey are paladar owners, but no Afro-Cubans own paladares. This is the other most lucrative sector, private restaurants. Here we asked small business owners how much they make a month. And here, what I think the most interesting thing about this data is that you can see those who make less than $250, which are most Afro-Cubans fall into that group. So even if Afro-Cubans are small business owners, they still make a lot less than their white colleagues do. And this is, I think, very, very important to acknowledge that even if folks are involved in the private business sectors, they don't necessarily make the same amount of money. We also asked people if they have a bank account. And here, again, the findings were very, very diverse. Amongst white Cubans, 50% said they do and 50% don't. And a very small percentage of Afro-Cubans, as you can see, around 10% only have a bank account. Now, this says something about people's ability to save money and to accrue interest. We also asked them whether they have access to the internet, and here also, once again, we found that a lot of people don't have access to the internet. The internet in Cuba is still a very complicated issue, but it's also very expensive. So you need to have disposable income to be able to get online. And so amongst those people who do not have access at all, 70% of Afro-Cubans do not have access to the internet, and 25% of whites do not. Most people have access to the internet in a public space, i.e. they sit in a public park or along the Malecón or wherever. That is the largest group, including white Cubans, but they are 62%. So these are folks who have the disposable income to buy one of the cards to get online and are making the choice to spend their money on that. Now, I want to just quickly round it up and, in a few words, say that the Afro-Cuban population has, as we've seen, much less family abroad, something that we already knew, but also, as a result, receives much less remittances, which now also includes startup capital for this small business sector. As a result of this, within this new economy, Afro-Cubans have less opportunities to start a small business because of the lack of a sophisticated credit system in Cuba, which is really still lacking. And as a result, and even when they are small business owners, they are not making the same amount of income as their white colleagues. In conclusion, the Afro-Cuban population is being disadvantaged in this new Cuban economy, and racial inequalities continue to grow partly because of the remittance situation. I'm going to now hand it over to Bert, and he will talk about citizenship.
Well, thank you, Katrin. First, I want to say a bit why we do this, because it is not being done by the National Statistics Office. That's why we do the survey. Actually, there's someone who could do it much better than we can. But this is the only publication which really take the census data according to skin color. They just published 2016. And this comes up with the finding there are no significant differences. And that, of course, is because many questions are not asked. For instance, income is only measured in CUP, in Cuban pesos, and not in CUC, or not in hard currency. So there are no significant differences in that regard. And so with a lot of other questions, for instance, they do address the self-employment, and they find that there's a slight, I think it's 8.4% of whites who are self-employed and 6.8% among mulattoes and blacks. But they don't ask what type of self-employment. And so on our survey, we find that self-employment can mean you sell some peanuts on the streets, or you have a paladar where Obama goes to eat when he visits the island. So that's why I think that's the key motivation, actually, for doing this survey. And all we can do is work with semi-representative data at best, perhaps. They probably have much better data, and we kind of hope that they just publish all the data they have, and then we all know where we went wrong, perhaps. But for the time being, that is really the state of the official data, and that does not seem to be reflecting the society or the situation on the island. Just briefly to our data. That's our survey, how many whites and Afro-Cubans, the census data from the Cuban census are there, so it's not exactly the same, but it's not that far off, perhaps. And we've got another test, made another test on how reliable our data are in a way. And there we took as the closest proxy we could find to income, to how well off are people. We do have in the national statistics the net migration from one province to the other. And people migrate from the, let's say, poorer to the more wealthy regions. So that is the only indicator that really gives some indication in Cuban statistics on which provinces are better off or worse off. And we put them overlapping with our data from the province, because it was a nationwide survey. We had at least 50 survey interviews in every province. And we have a pretty good alignment of those two curves. Not a perfect one, that's not the case, but I think we can say that our data are not that bad in that respect. So the one point I want to single out here is, I mean, we've got many data on gender, on age, on educational level, but one I want to point out is the this aspect of citizenship. The Cuban Constitution does not foresee dual citizenship. There's a discussion and a new debate about the Constitution, but so far dual citizenship is not really an option. Still, many Cubans have it. And in our survey, it's 6%, and it's only whites who have it, and there's a good reason, or not a good reason, a bad reason for it, because the key factor giving dual citizenship was a Spanish law, the so-called Ley de Nietos. So if you have a Spanish grandfather, you could opt for Spanish citizenship, and by now we've got 140,000 Cubanoles, Cubans who have both passports, and there's more to come. And with travel liberalization, that has become a real asset. That is the people who can travel in and out easily, not only to Spain, also to the United States and elsewhere. And that is the people who do much of the petty commerce, because it's so much easier for them to go to Mexico and get things or whatever. So it is something we, okay, this is not, it's not only travel, it's also opening a bank account abroad. It's also having a credit card abroad. It's also, if you want to have an Airbnb, you are connected in a very, you've got possibilities to connect in a very different way than people who don't have this second citizenship. And now come pretty much the same data we had between Afro-Cubans and blacks, only with dual citizenship, which is only a white phenomenon in our survey, and by and large, I think it holds for the general population. And it's just a bit more extreme still. So here you've got the annual personal income, and of those who have dual citizenship, it's about 25% who are in the lowest category of income. And there are quite a few very much to the right where we didn't see any Afro-Cubans in the first graphs we had. And we've got also the activity of the business, and renting out rooms is a key thing people do who have family, not only family abroad, but also citizenship abroad or very close connections. So that also adds to the picture of inequality. And of course, that does not come as a surprise. Did you travel abroad since the migration law has passed? All dual citizens have done so. Even the Abuelo Guajiro was sent to Mexico to import stuff. And people who never went to Havana now went to Santo Domingo to get stuff in. And among those who have only Cuban citizenship, much, much less have traveled in regard. So there are some lessons from the Cuban case that go beyond Cuba. I know that most of you probably are interested much in the Cuban case, but I think it's very interesting that the debates about dual citizenship in Europe, and I suppose here too, are very much domestic issues. In Spain, that was a domestic law, and it was not discussed on what impact will it have in Cuba or elsewhere. But they have a strong impact on the countries of origin, and dual citizenship is a resource and a privilege. And if it is based on descent, dual citizenship will reinforce, by and large, the social and racial hierarchies which have been already existing there due to the colonial past of not only Cuba, but also of other countries. It's more extreme in Cuba than it's in Buenos Aires because of the situation we have described. But that is one of the issues I take home also for our debates, where all the liberals and lefties, we always are in favor of dual citizenship and integration, and it does have impact we do not really foresee, and we don't really want to drive inequality in Cuba, but that is what's happening if you do it not by lottery or by other means, but by descent. So just a last note perhaps on the Cuban debate. There is a current debate precisely also on the data, which I have been referring to earlier. Cuba just launched, or just published something for the United Nations where they said it was about discrimination of all type, of gender, of whatever, and Cuba presented itself very favorably there. But the issue of race, of ethnic background, is something that is hardly touched at all. I showed you the one publication that does, and this is a blog by Esteban Morales, one of the black scholars, activists in Cuba, who precisely criticizes that and says, this is denying a reality. It's always been the skin color, or however you want to call it, was always a variable which has been restructuring society, and it still does. And if our statistics apparatus does not take account of it or does not publish, or we know what they publish, then we have a serious problem, and that is something society should debate. So with that, I would close to leave time for the discussion. There's much more in the survey, of course, but I think it gives you an idea of what we've been doing, and we wish we would have better news in a way to report from the island, but that is perhaps so far for the moment. Thank you very much.
much for this presentation. And now, of course, we are open to questions.
Very privileged to get this first pass at your new research, and congratulations. This is, as you said, very rare and pioneer and a very important topic. My questions are these. If you could talk, either one of you, but Catherine mentioned it, more about this, the way that you operationalize, or why you chose Afro-Cuban and white, and get a little bit more into the detail about that. You said that there was no disagreement between the subject and the researcher, and I'd be fascinated to hear more about that. And then the other is the methodology or the challenge of carrying out this research in Cuba, getting permissions and finding the people who did the actual legwork. You mentioned, I think, that you had two persons who were doing some of it or all of it. If you could speak a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Sorry, I just spaced out. I was going to ask the question about how the racial categories as well, but then I have two questions. I was curious to hear more about the methodology in terms of the interview, and how did the people you interviewed know you were studying racial disparities, and did you get other kind of qualitative information from them about that? Did they want to talk about that, right? Did it come up in conversation with the people you interviewed? So that's one. The other thing is, it's great that you didn't do just Havana. I wanted to hear more about what differences you found between Havana and the provinces.
Yeah, I'm also interested in the question of how your study is received and accepted in Cuba, but the specific question I had is, you've done 200 interviews in addition to the surveys, and you probably have a lot of data on quality of life, and I'm wondering if you could say something about, from the qualitative aspect of your research, how this data translates into the quality of life differences between blacks and Afro-Cubans and whites. And the issue of age is another question that I have, and whether you've analyzed the data in terms of age and how that plays out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your questions. So I'll kind of take over the methodological part. As I mentioned, we had 4 research assistants. So because we wanted to administer surveys in all provinces, which I couldn't do alone, I worked with 4 researchers who I've been working with on a number of projects, basically for the last 15 years, most of who I trained. All of who are social scientists and are Cubans and work in different provinces at their respective universities, and who have worked with me on different projects before. So I did some of the surveys, mainly in Havana and west of Havana, and the other researchers were, in Central Havana and Central Cuba and Eastern Cuba. So we call this a semi-representative survey because, as you all know, it's very difficult to do research in Cuba. It is very difficult to do survey research in Cuba. And although we did this research, officially, we had official permission to do this. Not everybody always knew what we were doing. This is, as you probably all know, it's very hard to do research, and you kind of got to do what you got to do to get the data. So my colleagues and I used the snowball method, which is, you interview people and they introduce you to people they know, and you kind of then go with a flow, but the chain is based on trust. So this is how we worked. We worked with people who I trust, who know people who they trust, and so on and so forth. Within that context, we took into consideration gender, obviously race, generation or age, urban versus rural issues, etc. So we were very mindful of all those main categories we wanted to have represented in our survey. we did this over an 8-month period. We also, and I mainly did the interviews, by the way. So I'm a social anthropologist, so I wanted to have some qualitative data beyond the quantitative. And it really is very complementary in terms of the detail and the nuance, et cetera, and I can say more about that. So we did not run into any problems doing this research, knock on wood. There were some hiccups here and there, but nothing major. And so people were very responsive. I mean, I think the way we did this, the fact that we interviewed people who were sort of introduced to each other was very important. You know, nobody did this because they didn't want to. Everybody was on board. And so trust and being okay with going, and this is a very, very long survey. This is not a one-page survey. It was altogether
50 questions.
Yeah, 50 questions. I mean, it took time, and people really needed to dedicate the time. And it was not just given to them and then given back. You know, people sat, the researchers and I sat with the folks and administered the survey. And we got into, you know, conversations with people by doing so. And so there was, you know, on the most part, really goodwill. People were interested in these issues because, again, we didn't just ask about race. We asked about all sorts of issues. But yes, we did introduce the survey to people saying what our general intentions and interests were, asking about issues of migration, remittances, but also within this new economy, issues around labor and work. And people were very interested in also us being interested in those issues. And so on the whole, I cannot remember one incident where people were not interested in working with us. People were very, very motivated to share their experiences with us on the whole. But again, we didn't stand on a street corner and randomly ask people, right? So this is not New York or Times Square. This is Cuba, and it's complicated. So in terms of our racial definition, so all of you, I'm sure, know how complicated issues of race, racial identities are in Cuba, and there are many different adjectives that are used to refer to different phenotypes. I didn't want to get stuck in that mess. That was not the focus of this research. This research was and is about trying to understand the role of migration in particular and remittances and citizenship within this new economy, and who are the winners and who are the losers. And so we really wanted to understand, generally speaking, why, and you probably all know who've been to Cuba lately, all of this anecdotal information we have. You go to any paladar, it's owned by a white person, it's staffed by a white person. What is going on here? And I was sick and tired of hearing people tell me, oh, that's just your experiences. So I wanted to get some data, and I wanted it to be fairly easy to understand, and I didn't want to get bogged down in categories of people's differences around phenotype. And this is why I made this decision after many discussions with colleagues who work on race in Cuba to use only two categories, Blanco y Afro-Cubano, and everybody who was phenotypically of African descent would be included in the Afro-Cubano group. Then I talked to a few folks who work on similar issues and have used surveys in other Latin American countries, and they suggested I do this, you ask the interviewee and the interviewer, so you have two opinions in this. And this seemed to work. There were, as I said, there were no discrepancies between, in all of the 1,050 interviews, which was amazing. And I'm glad there were not, obviously, but it also was not an issue. People, on the whole, there were no discussions around whether somebody was white or not, or Afro-Cubano or not. So it worked out, but it could have become more complicated for sure. So I answered the question, yes, people knew that our focus was race, amongst other things. Now, in terms of the differences between the provinces and Havana, maybe you wanted to take that?
I mean, we've got a whole folder of regional analysis, and we also got age analysis. And I just can say the most striking differences we really found in the category you presented. So in the regional distribution, it is by and large what you would expect. Havana has the highest income, the highest internet access, the highest, and the eastern provinces, Guantanamo, the lowest and the lowest. So that is pretty much what you would think of. You also have a certainly higher Afro-Cuban population share in the eastern provinces, but that is not as stark. I mean, it's quite considerable, the difference between Havana and Guantanamo, but it's nothing so surprising, actually, and it doesn't seem to be the crucial fault line of society. If you get into the detailed analysis of Guantanamo, you reproduce the same things we have. The whites in Guantanamo are also better off than the blacks in Guantanamo. So that is perhaps the answer to that. I can share the data with you. I've got them on my computer, but not on, I kind of put it on the screen now. I just want to mention two things, perhaps. We're speaking about the new economy and the inequalities it produces. The biggest producer of inequality is the collapse of the old economy. We should not forget that the state economy was the big social elevator that brought up the formerly lower strata of society up, and the devaluation of those salaries is what is driving them down. That's why the waiter's earning so much money, because the steel worker isn't. So I just want to emphasize this. It's not only the market, it's the failure of the state, which just pays $30 for the teacher. So that is also very important for the Cuban policy debate. There is a strong sector in the Cuban, also government party and everywhere, which knows about inequality, which doesn't like it, which tries to do things against it. And that, to a large extent, goes into an anti-reform movement and putting brakes on reform, limiting the accumulation of wealth and the like. This is only part of the problem. It doesn't help the salaries in the state sector. And that's why I would want to emphasize, we're not trying to say, well, if you don't open to the market, everything is better. Quite to the contrary, one of the findings actually is that the way the openings were done, in the case of the two biggest self-employed earners, that's Bed and Breakfast and that's Paladares, that was not transparent market with conditions the same for everybody. It depended on your property. That was largely pre-revolutionary property in a country where the state actually owns all the cafeterias and could rent out the cafeteria on an auction basis, could have credits, at least in the times when Chavez gave money, there was possibilities like this. And you could have, the Cuban state could have done a market opening much fairer in those terms, but it would have been more of a marketing. Fidel didn't want to really have a gastronomic private sector. So he said, only in the living room and only 12 seats and the like. But this was the nucleus of what we see here, that was the wines. The Afro-Cubans who probably worked in the restaurant couldn't take over the restaurant because there was no modality for that. And this is one of the issues, I think, that really needs to be thought of in terms of what is the policy implications from what we find here. It is not necessarily the fault of the reforms, but the way they were managed, and by now and then lack of access to capital other than the immigrants' capital, the lack of a credit system in the country which would be accessible to that. I think that is one of the things I really would want to stress. And the other thing I want to stress, I wasn't asked that, but I want to stress it, we don't do this to bash the Cuban government. And if we speak about the inequalities, in many parts of the region, they are worse. And we don't have ghettos in the way we have in other places. We don't have, that is not the case to say the worst of them all. Only that for Cuba, it means such a different thing because it was a revolution in the name of social inequality, social equality, and that is such a strong legitimizing moment of the revolution, also one of the big achievements they had. And that's why it's kind of painful to see how these mechanisms are working. And in the 90s, remittances made a change in the living standards, but now they make a change in the logic of accumulation that goes much more profoundly restructuring the society and the properties and the economic basis of the society. That's probably the big difference to the 1990s.
Thank you. I'm just going to follow up on your last comments because the question goes towards your hoped for outcomes for your study. In terms of Cuban policy, anticipating that there are probably reformers in the Cuban government who support and will fight for even a small expansion of privatization. And there are factions in the government that probably will say, see, we told you so. If you open up the economy even a little bit, it's just going to contribute to social stratification and racial inequities, which is exactly what we don't want under the revolution. So if the Cuban government is part of your intended audience for this study, my question was, what type of policies are we hoping for and fighting for? Maybe you already answered that, but if you have anything else to add.
I'm not sure I understood you correctly in your explanations of reform, but if I understood you correctly, you seem to be saying or implying that the concern of people in the government about the reforms are the growth of inequality. And it might be, it's quite possible some people are that way, but I think there is another sector, and I cannot measure, which is far more afraid of their losing control. Because let's not lose sight of the context of the one-party state in Cuba and the bureaucracy and so on. And I think that losing control, I suspect, I would have to empirically go and study it if I could, but I suspect that's a much more powerful motivator to resist the reforms because they see Cuba is not an island. It's an island, but it's not an island in terms of the history of this kind of system, whatever you call it. And they can see what's happening in China, Vietnam, and other places. These people are not ignorant. And they don't want to be in a situation that a nomenclature, even though that term is not used in Cuba, will lose control. In any case, if you could elaborate again what would be, because I couldn't quite follow you, what would be a more just reform program? You know, why could they have done that? It wasn't done regardless of whether it's because of loss of control or whatever.
In terms of the efficiency of the remittances in creating dynamism in the economy through formation of small businesses, even granting that the design is sound, and we would have to perhaps discuss that more. Well, do you have it? Can you bear on the argument that even those who received fewer remittances, in this case, which happen to be in terms of this comparison, Afro-Cubans, even those do better than those who do not receive? Can you estimate the efficiency in terms of the impact? How much impact do whatever they receive has in terms of making them successful entrepreneurs? I think that actually is a question that applies to both all strata of this sample in terms of the efficiency of remittances. The other related question, and again, it builds on the first question or comment on policy focus, is what would be the policy implications, assuming that you're focused on small business formation for all stakeholders? I guess the third question for me is the sample. I came a bit late, I was outside. I'd like to know more about the sample, how many from Oriente, how many from Havana, and how many from Central Cuba. I mean, we know that that could be a factor for many reasons. So I wonder if you could elaborate on differences across those three categories. I mean, Central Cuba is more white. Havana has received migration of blacks over the last 40 years, much of which replenished the Afro-Cuban labor force population, whereas Southern Oriente historically has been and remains more Afro-Cuban, right? So I wonder if that makes a difference in terms of the efficiency or any of the output variables that you're focused on.
In terms of what we hope to, who we hope to influence, who's listening. So yes, I mean, obviously we didn't just do this for fun, and we hope certain people will, use this data and think about it in terms of social policy. So the Cuban government, I mean, I think that there are a few things they could think about doing. As you probably all know, Cuba has a universal social program. So, everybody gets free healthcare, everybody gets free education, everybody has a libreta. And this, I am not the first one to say this. Most people who work on social issues in Cuba do argue that what Cuba really needs to do is have more targeted social programs. So really focus on the communities that are the most marginalized and really support them and not help everybody. So that's one thing that would be very favorable. In terms of the small business community specifically, as I mentioned in my part of the talk, one thing that is really missing so far in Cuba is a more, let's call it, sophisticated credit system. There is a credit system, but it's very, very hard, almost impossible for most average Cubans with no assets to get a loan. And so, open up Cuba to microfinancing and the like would be very, very positive, so that more Cubans in general, but also more Afro-Cubans who have great business ideas but do not have capital, so that they can get capital too, and be part of this new economy. Obviously, business training is very important. At the moment, there is only one place in Havana and two others in the provinces that offers a sort of 101 course on business training. It's offered through the umbrella of the Catholic Church. Many people don't know about this, and they already have waiting lists of people who want to take this course. So that would be something that would also be very, very positive, as would having wholesale markets, etc. The other thing I want to really emphasize is, within the private sector, there has not been a real debate yet in Cuba about hiring practices. So, I mean, if you walk into most paladares or, these fancy hair salons, you will mainly see and learn that the owners are usually white, but also the staff is white and most of the clientele is white. And so we need to have a discussion and hopefully laws at some point, which I don't want to, I mean, I'll call it affirmative action for now because I'm lacking a better word, but some kind of legal policy that guarantees that all Cubans have access to work in the private sector as employees, and that there's some legal basis behind that. That does not exist in Cuba. And the other thing that would also be, I think, very positive, particularly if Cuba does open up to foreign direct investment, is that foreign companies should be sensitized to the Cuban socio-racial reality and know that there are, all sorts of Cubans who need work. And so that foreign companies, when and if they go into Cuba and invest in Cuba, also make informed decisions on who they hire. I think this is one thing that went really wrong at the beginning when the tourist industry opened up in Cuba and a lot of foreign investment came in, and there were these terrible hiring practices. So there needs to be a more informed discussion on that as well. You want to take over the other questions?
Well, I think it connects in a way. Who is our audience? I mean, of course, you never know who might end up reading or hearing about the study, but it's not only the Cuban government, of course, but for instance, we've been speaking to churches who do charitable work in Cuba, and they wonder who are those in need, who are the needy ones. And this race issue, for instance, is not entirely new, but it does not really, it's not on the mindset. Cuba is very often seen as a rather equal society, and it's been, and there are elements that still are, for instance, the inclusive school system and whatnot. But this has been quite important for them to, as a kind of feedback mechanism on society and where should they work. That's not policy of the government level, but that similarly, if you have foreign be it German or American or Cuban American organizations who want to foster the self-employed sector. If you just do it in a colorblind way, you're going to reinforce these trends. Some may want that. We don't think it's the best way to go about it colorblind and just pretend that this is not the case. So I think there are implications not only for the Cuban government, but also here. As to Cuba, probably my biggest hope actually is to feed into the debate and to have a debate also on the availability of the data. And I mean, we also must be realistic. Raul Castro will not invite us for tea to let us present, but in the academic environment, this has already found some echo. And of course, this is going to spread in some way where it's beyond what we can tell. But that is our idea to help with the survey to stimulate a certain debate. And as I said, if the National Statistics Office would come out with all the data they have and publish them, that would be great. It wouldn't change the situation on the ground for the people, but that also would be an outcome. The question about does the government care about inequality or do they care about control? Well, of course they do care about control. But they also care about participation in the new equality. So if the father is a general, the son maybe has a paladar. That combines in Cuba. And it's not completely that some are in control and some are that. And I think for the population and the mechanisms, there is a strong element of the promise of a certain social equality that people try to get through the state. And they may not be happy with it, but the state has to respond to that. So if you've got a National Party Assembly or a provincial assembly, those will be debates people have, probably not in these terms, but they are not happy about the golf course. If you're in the teachers' union, you care about a certain thing, that is your salary, and you're not that happy to see how Vedado is opening up to all the more bed and breakfast because you're not part of that story. And so I think there are pressures, and the organizations, even if they're vertical, even if they're authoritarian, have to interact with that. In their way, I don't want to idealize anything, but it is a process in Cuba that is being part of the fabric of the political society and of the organizations that are. And perhaps one thing about the efficiency of remittances is that in creating entrepreneurs, I think much of the remittances is a social safety net. Most of the remittances don't create entrepreneurs. They are to have the old lady get a better diet, or get the kids to get an English class, or whatever. I mean, very basic things. There are some who invest, and that's probably not what people would call always remittances, but that's a joint family investment. Kind of, I buy a house as a Cuban with the money from. my relatives abroad. But most remittances are not to create entrepreneurs. And that's why the question of efficiency, and that's not only Cuba, I mean, that's Mexico, most remittances are there to support daily life. And that is what they do in Cuba also to the biggest extent. And perhaps the last thing, just to add on what Katrin said about the labor practices in Cuba in the private sector. That's one of the policy issues that is up in Cuba, that they didn't like this private sector, so they didn't really care about the working conditions in the private sector. All the trade unions, the protections are very well spelled out for everybody who is working in the public administration or in a state company. But what's happening in the Paladar, no trade union cares about that. There's no, and if they work 8 hours or they work 12 hours, or if that is very unregulated, precisely because it was not a coherent reform process with one step, and that is terrible for a country who is socialist and who will have this private sector for quite some time in the future, and they really have to get into gear to implement the labor relations in a way they want to have them in socialist terms, also in the on social terms or whatever it would be, in protective terms, also in the private economy, in the private sectors of economy. And there's really a blind spot in the political system, and to a large extent, because the people who work in the private sector are usually very happy that they work in the private sector because they get better pay. So they work longer hours and they don't complain, but that cannot be the solution, actually.
Can I just add one more quick thing to Samuel's question about control and inequality? Now, I would say, well, the government probably is more concerned about controlling the status quo, but they should be caring about inequality. Why? Beyond the obvious, because, and this also answers somebody's question who I didn't answer about quality of life. I mean, I was the person who went into the homes to do the interviews, and I traveled all over the island, and I am an anthropologist and I've seen a lot, but I have seldom seen such huge differences in quality of life in the many years I've done research in Cuba. And the big difference between now and even 5 or 10 years ago is that under Raúl and in this new economy, it is no longer politically incorrect to show what you have. So people are really showing their goods openly. How they dress, what kind of car they have. Before you would only know more or less what people had when you went into their homes, and they wouldn't paint their house outside. And now there is a new culture, or a resurfaced old culture, that is showing people what they have. And this is causing people who don't have much or have nothing to be frustrated and to be angry. And this is something I felt a lot in the interviews, is in terms of emotion, not only living standards and quality of life, but emotionally, a lot of Afro-Cubans are angry. And so I think that the issue of control and inequality is related. And because Cuba, more than ever before, in this period of its history, is really and the speed here, I think, is important. I mean, we've seen such massive differences in the quality of life in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, there are a lot of people who are seriously rich in Cuba, and there are people who are living in poverty that is also new. And those two realities are completely connected to race. And so, I think that the government needs to be worried about this for reasons of control. But also, let me just end on this maybe. There are, both in urban and rural areas, levels of poverty today in Cuba that are, akin to many of the neighboring islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the region that we often don't know about because these people don't have family abroad, because these people are not linked into a network where they can get support beyond, say, the churches, et cetera, et cetera. And these rifts are growing as we speak. And so I hope that with this study we can, bring some attention to the reality, but also some of the solutions that we hope somebody will listen to.
First, I really salute you, and I'm just so happy to see this study, and I eagerly look forward to your publications, because this is, well, it's just a huge problem. But the question I originally wanted to ask you, to do interview research, I had to go through, you won't believe if I told you, it took over 2 years to get approval, and I had to submit all the questions. Did you have to go through some kind of process to get approval, or did your Cuban counterparts that are part of your team, did they do that for you? And how long did that take? It's a practical research question.
Really brief. Thank you very much. I think I wasn't expecting a lot of new information on Cuban, because I know, for the simple that to begin with, we had to go and look at the history of the Cuban and Cuban people, how the Cuban was founded. It was not a nation that was founded to become a nation of educated people, a nation of free. It was founded as a nation to money making. It's a colonial power. It was for profit. It was never considered to be less, give freedom and the quality of life, of let's Christianize things just because we want to civilize it. Every time I live abroad, different countries, and I see exactly the same problem in all the colony that was founded for profit. Brazil, Haiti, Dominican Republic, the United States. This is a problem that the government cannot solve because it's the average citizen. 500 years of slavery, of profit, of colonial power. That's nothing the Cuban government can do. Absolutely nothing. It's the average people. It's to bring and to have new leaders with new ideas to the battle of the foreign investment with the foreign mentality. That's the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Yannis Zeligakis from the Henry George School of Social Science. I want to echo the last question and to tell you exactly, it's pessimistic to try to do social programs in an economy which is predicated on rent-seeking. There is no way workers, small businessmen are ever going to make more than crumbs in such an economy, no matter how many crumbs you give them. It's obvious. And also there's the issue of the trust networks. It's not about the race. I mean, the association by color happens because there is a trust that had preceded that association. So how are you going to create more trust, let's say, in the colored communities of Cuba, the Afro? It's only through education, and that's going to take a couple of decades. It cannot happen overnight. So what are, in terms of social programs, what are the innovations and how you're going to bring in higher education? And what is the foreign NGO component is contributing to that? That would be an avenue. Thank you.
Really quickly, because people are talking about what social programs they can, that Cuba can implement that might work and that might not, and that would take generations and decades, Catherine mentioned legal change. And it's interesting now with the Constitution, and I don't know if any of these kinds of questions will be part of the debate. I suspect not, but they should be, as you said. And I think you mentioned the idea of making sure that all Cubans have a legal right to participate in this economy. And I think I would just go further and say that instead of what you might call a positive right of access, I think it's useful to think about the legal criminalization of discrimination. I think ultimately that's what's needed. So it's not so much a question as a comment, right? Penalizing discrimination, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief too. Catherine, I don't disagree with what you said about they should be worried about this, but I think if we take a step back and we think about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the framework in which this is happening, what alternatives are there for the people in power and what they have to preserve other than what they did? Not because I'm for it, of course not. But the question is, given the alternatives I'd like to contemplate, then it seems to me that what they did is within the realm of what was most likely to happen, particularly in light of the experience of Vietnam and China. Because the alternative to that would be to go to a Kampuchean genocidal type of policy and try to stuff down the throats of people something when there is nothing to distribute. So I think this is the issue. And there are alternatives. For example, I totally agree with Professor Hoffman about the decline of the state sector. But the fact is that state workers cannot freely organize to defend their interests. They have these bureaucratic state unions that prevent them from doing so. That could be a practical instrument through them to try to improve the situation. And by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but Professor Hoffman, my understanding is that the ZSA is organizing, or so they claim. They claim that the number of members for the official trade unions is growing leaps and bounds in that self-employment sector. Maybe they're lying. If you have something, no, honestly, if you have something to say about that, I would appreciate it. But that's what they're claiming, that they're organizing all those people in the state unions.
I have a friend in Cuba who's a cuentapropista, and when he saw the new regulations that came out in July, he described them to me as 127 páginas de negativismo, 127 pages of negativism. But in my own research and reading the regulations, there are some new rules or stipulations or requirements that try to get at this issue of discrimination in the private employment sector. If you could speak to that, if you know about that, or if you've heard anything about how that might be implemented beyond just rules in this new packet of laws that was issued in July. Thanks.
And well, I just want to add something, and actually it's something I would like to, if possible, if you can talk about that, because in your research so there is something that for me is somehow missing, and it's the structure of power. So we are talking what the power can do, or if they want, and then from my point of view as a Black Cuban, there is always something missing somehow, and it's the systemic characteristic of this racial inequality in Cuba. So I think that some people have been somehow addressing this issue, that this is not something that started in 2006 with Raúl Castro's reforms. We have been pushing it somehow to the end of to the collapse of the socialist system in the 1990s, but it's something probably that comes before that, from even before 1959, before before the beginning of the 20th century, when the Cuban Republic was established, it was created. So so it's what is somehow. So I have said that I was waiting a little bit more about this in your data, and so it's how these racial inequalities and racial ideology, I will say, is ingrained within Cuba, the Cuban society in general, not only in the island but also the diaspora. And then how much a power that has been always predominantly white in Cuba can address those issues, not because they are phenotypically white or not, but mostly concerning something that is what's called here, everybody knows about it, is white privilege. So what happens with, when the power in Cuba has been always in somehow in hands of this somehow the same elites? I don't know if you have worked on that. I'm sorry that is your question, but I had this on my mind. I couldn't stop myself. Yeah, I couldn't stop myself. I was ready.
Okay. So in terms of the getting approval, yes, I mean it can be very time consuming to get approval for one's research. So yes, we did get approval. Now I've been doing research in Cuba as an anthropologist for 20 years now, and so I have a lot of contacts, I kind of know how to get approval quickly, and I think that is one of the things that has helped us be able to do this, in a fairly timely fashion. Also working with people on the ground who just know how to work on the ground. So, but I do understand that it can be very, very difficult. But again, I mean, it's just time and contacts helped. I completely understand and, want to go into this debate about, white privilege and education and all of these issues that have been mentioned. I'm not quite sure how to go at it though, because it's such a bomb. But I think that one thing that we should remember is that, yes, Cuba has been, like most of the Caribbean and the Latin American area in general, has for centuries been the product of structural racism. And we cannot, leave that out. I mean, I tried to address this briefly in my introduction, but we really wanted to present our findings. But our findings are not separate from the history of Cuba, obviously. But Cuba is, people like to say it's exceptional, but it did make a difference with the revolution through, its radical social policies, particularly education. And so Cuba, unlike many other of its neighboring countries, has a very educated population. And I would argue very strongly that if a large part of the Afro-Cuban population had access to startup capital like their white counterparts do, many of them have great business ideas and would be very, very successful in the private sector. We're dealing with a country where the population in general is highly educated, and all Cubans have very, very strong networks amongst themselves. But some Cubans, and they tend to be mainly white Cubans, have one thing, which is family abroad that is right now the bank. And this is the big difference. And so, yes, it is not the answer to the Cuban economy, but some people are being left out. And I would say, actually, the majority of Cubans are being left out of this new economy. I'm not saying the new economy is perfect, but a lot more people need to be participating in it. And they're not having access to the economy because there is not greater access to credit. And it cannot be only those whose family members left who get credit. There is something truly tragic about that. And so I would argue that, yes, there is a lot of historical baggage there, but Cuba did do something different. For 30 plus years, with the support of its socialist allies, was able to educate the population on the whole, of which we both are products. And so now we are in a new phase, and a lot of people are being left out. And this cannot be the end of the story. And so we're trying to just raise attention to the fact that, unfortunately, in this new reality, socioeconomic reality, those that left are the ones that are funding those who stayed. And those people are mainly white.
Perhaps, to add one thing, the big social lift that was so special in the Cuban case after '59, that was through the state and through a hierarchy from above. So it was a white Fidel Castro at the top who put this elevator going up for many people. It was not, as you said, it was not the CTC organizing labor in a combatiente manner, nor was it Afro-Cuban associations. Those were not the actors of the story. And that is also what is missing with the unions, but also with the, if you look at the racial situation, you don't have autonomous voice in a structured manner calling attention to these issues. And so that is where I think all the conquistas have their difficult side to sustain if that elevator breaks down, because the repair team is not there. Perhaps one question was on the constitution, if that is changing something. I think two things are noteworthy, of course, that it will eliminate the prohibition of the exploitation of one person by the other. And that was a phrase which was still there, which actually went against all the self-employment sector who was not self-employed only, but is employing others. But they took so long to acknowledge that reality. This term self-employment, trabajar por cuenta propia, was stretched to accommodate for people who run a paladar and there's 15, 20 people working for the owner, or at times more. And so that is where the CTC didn't really enter, because it was the patron and the worker, they were all trabajadores por cuenta propia. So that is something, by acknowledging that there's a small and medium enterprise, actually then you can start to organize workers in a small enterprise, but you first have to acknowledge that, if not, the owner is a trabajador, a worker. So I think that is changing for the good in a way, by adapting the constitution to the reality that is, and that it can allow a different type of organization. And the other thing with the constitution will change in its draft version, and that part certainly will go through, is that dual citizenship is accommodated for. It's not outspokenly recognized, but there's a passage that says that dual citizenship can not be made active within Cuba. You cannot reclaim, I'm Spaniard, I'm going to the embassy, and then the Spanish embassy. But that recognize that people have a second citizenship, so that get that out of the limbo without any structural change. But some things are being addressed. And perhaps really the final word was on trust. I don't think trust is the key issue that is the difference between blacks and whites in Cuba. It is access to resources. And the key resources are broad. There's some nomenclatura resources, and there also are, the party has also resources. The people who work in the border control will get the money from some share of that. It's not the only resource coming from abroad, but that's the key resource from abroad, and the connections to the resources abroad are so different because of the racialized past, which translate into racialized migration patterns and the pre-revolutionary property coming in. So with that, perhaps I would end. Thank you very much for being here, for coming here, for very interesting questions. I very much enjoyed it.